The sound of a deadbolt locking. That heavy metallic click. It is a sound you expect in a prison, not in a brightly lit electronics repair shop in downtown Seattle. But that was exactly what I heard when George Higgins, a man I had known since he was just a kid riding bicycles with my son, turned the lock on the back room door. He did not look at me. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely slide the deadbolt into place. He grabbed me by the forearm and pulled me deeper into the cramped, windowless storage room that smelled of burnt rosin and stale coffee. I am a 73-year-old man. I spent 40 years of my life as a structural engineer building steel bridges that can withstand earthquakes. I am not easily shaken. But when George leaned in close, his face pale and covered in a cold sweat, the whisper that left his lips made my blood run completely cold. He said, "Check the will, Uncle Rick. You are next." Let me pause right here. If you are watching this video right now, I need you to listen very carefully. Sometimes the people we build our entire lives around, the people we share our homes and our wealth with, are the very ones waiting for us to close our eyes so they can take everything. If you have ever felt that sting of betrayal from your own flesh and blood, please hit the subscribe button right now. Tell me in the comments what city or state you are watching from. It gives me strength to know I am not speaking into the void, and it helps this channel bring these important stories to light. Do not forget to like this video, because what I am about to tell you will make you question everything you thought you knew about family loyalty. I stood there in the dim light of the back room staring at George. I asked him what he was talking about. My wife Diane had passed away 6 months ago. The coroner said it was a sudden heart attack in the middle of the night, a tragic, unavoidable event for a woman her age. I had brought her glasses to George just an hour earlier. They were a pair of expensive tortoise-shell smart glasses I had bought for her last Christmas. Diane had started showing early signs of mild memory loss, nothing severe, just forgetting where she put her keys or whether she had taken her vitamins. The glasses had a built-in camera and voice assistant to help her record small reminders. The right hinge had come loose, and I simply wanted George to tighten it so I could keep them in a memory box on my nightstand. George did not answer my question. Instead, he turned to his cluttered workbench. Monitors cast a harsh blue glow across his face. He picked up Diane's glasses. His hands were still trembling as he plugged a small black cable into the hidden port on the frame, connecting it directly to his main computer terminal. I watched his fingers fly across the keyboard. He was breathing heavily, almost panicking. He looked over his shoulder at the locked door, as if he expected someone to bust through it at any second. I asked him again, raising my voice. "George, what is going on? What do you mean I am next?" George swallowed hard and pointed at the computer screen. He told me that when he plugged the glasses in to run a diagnostic on the onboard memory, he found something buried deep in the system. He explained that someone had tried to wipe the internal drive. They had performed a factory reset, but whoever did it was sloppy. They did not realize that this specific model of smart glasses automatically backs up its video cache to a hidden encrypted partition on the internal drive before any manual deletion can take place. George told me he recovered a video file, the last video file recorded on the night Diane died. I felt a strange pressure building in my chest. A structural engineer knows when a foundation is about to crack. You do not always see it, but you can feel the shift in the weight. My entire reality was resting on a fault line, and George was about to trigger the earthquake. He clicked his mouse. A loading bar appeared on the screen, extracting the recovered file. George turned to me, his eyes full of a profound, heartbreaking pity. He said, "Uncle Rick, somebody brought this exact pair of glasses into my shop 2 days after Aunt Diane died. They asked my assistant to completely wipe the memory. They paid in cash. My assistant did the standard wipe, but he did not clear the ghost partition. I only found it today because I ran a deep sector scan to check the battery health." "Who brought them in?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low growl. George looked down at the floor. "It was Bradley," he whispered. Bradley. My son. My 42-year-old son. The boy I had carried on my shoulders. The boy I had sent to the best private schools in Seattle, paying for his fancy degree so he could become a hotshot venture capitalist. The boy who had stood beside me at Diane's funeral, crying into my shoulder, telling me we only had each other. Why would Bradley secretly try to wipe his mother's glasses? Before I could process the betrayal of that single fact, the video file finished loading. The screen went black for a brief second. Then the footage began to play. It was completely silent at first. The camera angle was tilted low to the ground. It took my brain a few seconds to understand what I was looking at. It was the first-person perspective from the glasses. They were on Diane's face. The view was looking up from the floor of our living room. I could see the pattern of our Persian rug. I could see the edge of the mahogany coffee table I had built with my own hands. And then I heard it. The sound of my wife gasping for air. It was a horrible, wet, desperate sound. The camera shook violently as she struggled on the floor. She was having the heart attack. My hands gripped the edge of George's workbench so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to look away, but I was paralyzed. I was watching the final agonizing moments of the woman I had loved for 40 years. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what came into the frame next. 2 pairs of shoes stepped into the view of the camera. Expensive Italian leather loafers, and a pair of designer heels. The camera tilted slightly upward as Diane writhed on the floor. Standing over her, looking down with cold, emotionless expressions, were my son Bradley and his wife Monica. They were just standing there. They were not kneeling to help her. They were not holding her hand. They were not screaming for an ambulance. They were watching her die. The audio picked up a voice. It was Monica. Her tone was completely casual, as if she were discussing the weather. She looked at Bradley and said, "Let her go. Calling 911 now ruins the timeline." Bradley just nodded. He checked his watch. He literally looked at his watch while his mother choked on her last breaths at his feet. The video suddenly cut out. The screen went black. The silence in the back room of the tech shop was deafening. I could not breathe. I could not think. The steel pillars of my mind, the logic and reason I had relied on my entire life, completely collapsed. My son had murdered my wife, not with a weapon, but with cold, calculated apathy. He had watched her die to protect a timeline. What timeline? What plan? The words George whispered when he locked the door echoed in my ears like a siren. "Check the will. You are next." I had walked into that shop as a grieving widower, a retired engineer trying to hold on to a piece of plastic and glass to remember his wife. I walked out of that back room as a man who had nothing left to lose. I did not cry. I did not scream. A cold, dark clarity washed over me. Bradley and Monica thought they were dealing with a clueless, heartbroken old man. They thought I was just a stepping stone to whatever sick payout they were waiting for. They forgot who they were dealing with. I spent my life building things that could not be broken. Now I was going to use every ounce of my intellect, my resources, and my hidden strength to tear their lives down to the studs. I asked George to play the video again. He looked at me as if I had just asked him to hand me a loaded gun. His hands hovered over the keyboard, hesitating, his eyes pleading with me to let it go. But I did not move. I told him to press play. I needed to see it without the shock. I needed to watch it not as a grieving husband, but as a man examining a collapsed structure to find the exact point of failure. The screen flickered back to life. There it was again. The agonizing first-person view from Diane's glasses. The camera angle was low, capturing the intricate weaving of the Persian rug. That rug was an anniversary gift I bought her in Istanbul. Now it was her deathbed. The microphone picked up the horrific rattling sound of her lungs fighting for air. It is a sound that will echo in my nightmares until the day I die. Then came the polished Italian leather shoes. Bradley. my own flesh and blood. Standing right beside him were the sharp designer heels of my daughter-in-law, Monica. I watched their body language this time. There was no panic. There was no sudden shock. They were standing perfectly still like two executives evaluating a real estate investment. Let me tell you about my life before this moment. For 40 years, I worked as a senior structural engineer here in Seattle. If you have ever driven across the city, you have probably trusted your life to the steel and concrete I designed. My job was to calculate stress load bearing capacities and the exact limits of physical tension. I spent decades ensuring that when a storm hit, my bridges would hold. I applied that exact same philosophy to my family. I thought I was building an indestructible foundation for Bradley. When he was young, I worked 80-hour weeks, so he would never know the anxiety of an unpaid bill. I paid his tuition at an Ivy League university in full. When he wanted to start his venture capital firm, I gave him his first round of seed money. I was the reinforced steel in his life, absorbing all the pressure so he could stand tall. But as I stared at the computer monitor watching him look at his watch, while his mother suffocated, I realized the horrifying truth. The bridge I built for my family was completely rotten from the inside out. I had reinforced his wallet, but I had completely neglected to build his conscience. The audio played again. Monica's voice cut through the sound of Diane's suffering. Let her go. Calling 911 ruins the timeline. The timeline. Those two words hit me harder than a physical punch. What timeline were they talking about? A heart attack is sudden. It is chaos. It does not have a timeline unless the event was anticipated or worse, orchestrated. I asked George to pause the video right on Bradley's face. The image froze. I stared into the eyes of the boy I had raised. I looked for any trace of the child who used to fall asleep on my chest while we watched baseball games. I looked for the young man who cried at his high school graduation because he was so proud to make me and Diane happy. There was nothing there. His eyes were flat, impatient, and utterly devoid of humanity. He was looking at his mother not as a human being, but as an obstacle that was finally being cleared from his path. I felt a coldness spread through my veins. It was not the icy grip of panic. It was the absolute zero of pure, unadulterated focus. When a bridge collapses, an engineer does not cry over the twisted metal. He examines the stress fractures. He analyzes the shear forces. He finds out exactly who approved the faulty materials, and he holds them accountable. I turned to George. He was quietly weeping in his chair, wiping his face with the back of his hand. I placed my hand on his shoulder. My grip was firm, steady, and devoid of the trembling that had gripped me just 10 minutes earlier. I told him to make a copy of the file. I told him to put it on an encrypted flash drive, and I told him to completely wipe the system cache, just like his assistant had failed to do. I needed Bradley to believe he had gotten away with it. I needed him to think his secret was safely buried in the grave with my wife. George nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard to execute my instructions. He asked me what I was going to do. He offered to call the police right then and there. I shook my head. The police would look at a video of two people failing to act during a medical emergency. They might charge them with negligence or failure to render aid, but high-priced lawyers would tear that apart in a courtroom. They would claim shock, panic, or confusion. They would walk away with a slap on the wrist, and they would still have their freedom. No, the justice system was not designed to punish this kind of profound evil. If Bradley and Monica had a timeline, it meant they had a larger plan. And if they had a plan, there was a paper trail. There was a motive. I needed to uncover every single layer of their deception before I finally struck. George handed me a small black flash drive. It felt incredibly heavy in the palm of my right hand. I slipped it deep into my coat pocket. I thanked him, swore him to absolute secrecy, and walked out of the back room. As I stepped out onto the cold, dark, rainy streets of Seattle, the grieving father was forever dead. In his place stood a focused engineer preparing for the greatest demolition of his entire life. I drove back to my empty house in silence. The rain beat against the windshield, matching the rhythm of my racing heart. I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel until my hands ached. I had to bury the rage. I had to lock it away in a steel vault deep inside my mind. If I walked through that front door looking like a man who knew his wife was murdered, I would lose my only advantage. I practiced my grieving widower face in the rearview mirror. I softened my eyes, slouched my shoulders, and let the exhaustion of my 73 years wash over my posture. When I finally unlocked the front door, the silence of the hallway felt heavier than ever. But I was not alone for long. Less than 20 minutes after I hung up my wet coat, the doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and felt a physical wave of nausea crash into my stomach. It was Bradley and Monica. They were standing on my porch, huddled under a large black umbrella, looking like a picture-perfect couple out of a magazine. Monica was holding a brown paper grocery bag. I took a deep breath, forced a fragile, trembling smile onto my face, and opened the door. Bradley immediately stepped inside and wrapped his arms around me. He pulled me into a tight hug. His cologne smelled expensive, sharp, and entirely out of place in my quiet home. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with a sickly, sweet sympathy. "We were just in the neighborhood, and we wanted to check on you. You should not be alone on a gloomy day like this." Monica nodded solemnly, stepping past us to place her grocery bag on the kitchen island. I thanked them, my voice intentionally raspy and weak. I walked slowly into the kitchen, dragging my feet just a little bit more than usual. Monica was already unpacking the bag. She pulled out a few containers of organic soup, some fresh fruit, and a large, expensive glass bottle of organic pomegranate juice. It was my favorite brand. The brand Diane used to buy for me every week to help with my blood pressure. Monica looked at me with those wide, innocent eyes that I now knew were completely hollow. "We brought you some dinner, Rick," she said softly. "Bradley noticed you have not been answering your phone much this week. We are just so worried about your health. You have been looking a little frail lately." The audacity of her words almost made me snap. She was standing in the exact spot where my wife had gasped for her last breath, acting like a concerned angel. I told them I was just tired, that I missed Diane. Bradley placed his hand on my shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I know, Dad," he murmured. "We all miss her. But Mom would want you to stay healthy. She would want you to take care of yourself." He reached over, unscrewed the cap of the pomegranate juice, and poured a generous amount into a crystal glass from the cabinet. He slid the dark red liquid across the marble countertop toward me. "Here, drink this," he insisted. "It is packed with antioxidants. It will give you some energy. You need to keep your strength up for the probate meetings next month." I stared at the glass. The dark ruby-red liquid caught the dim light of the kitchen pendant lamps. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the cold crystal. As I lifted the glass toward my face, the overhead light illuminated the rim. My background in structural engineering trained me to notice microscopic imperfections. To the untrained eye, the glass looked perfectly clean, but I could see it. Just along the inner edge, right where my lips were meant to touch the crystal, there was a faint powdery white residue. It was almost completely dissolved into the dark red juice, but not quite. The sediment was clinging to the microscopic ridges of the glass. My heart stopped. My gut instinct, honed by decades of survival in high-stakes construction, screamed at me. This was not a visit out of love. This was a calculated delivery. I did not know what that white powder was, but I knew with absolute certainty that it was part of their timeline. I brought the glass inches from my mouth. I paused. I looked up at Bradley. He was watching me intently. His casual posture was a complete lie. The muscles in his jaw were tight. His eyes were locked on the glass, tracking its movement toward my lips. Monica had stopped unpacking the groceries. She was standing perfectly still by the refrigerator, her gaze fixed on me. The silence in the kitchen stretched out, becoming thick and suffocating. They were waiting. They were holding their breath, waiting for me to swallow whatever poison they had crushed into my drink. I held the glass right under my nose. I could smell the tart, sweet scent of the pomegranate, masking whatever chemical was sitting on the rim. I smiled at my son. A slow, grateful, entirely fabricated smile. "You are right," I whispered, my voice thick with fake emotion. Diane always wanted me to take care of my heart, especially now that I am all alone in this big, empty house. I lowered the glass without taking a single sip and placed it gently back onto the cool marble counter. I appreciate the thoughtful gesture, but my stomach is feeling a little unsettled right now. I think I will save this juice for my dinner tonight, right after I have some of that hot organic soup you brought. The flash of sheer disappointment in Bradley's dark eyes was instant cold and absolutely terrifying. He quickly masked it with a nod, but the damage was done. I knew they were trying to kill me. They did not stay much longer after that. The conversation dried up quickly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that filled the kitchen like a heavy fog. Bradley checked his watch, the exact same gesture he made while standing over his dying mother, and announced they had to get back to the city for a dinner reservation. Monica gave me another hollow hug, her expensive perfume lingering in the air, like a toxic vapor. I stood perfectly still in the entryway until I heard his sports car roar to life and fade down the wet suburban street. Once the house was completely quiet, I walked back into the kitchen. I picked up the crystal glass. The dark red liquid swirled against the glass, the white residue still clinging to the rim. I did not pour it down the sink. If I poured it down the drain, I would have no visual evidence of their lethal intent. Instead, I carried the glass into the living room. By the large bay window stood a beautiful ficus plant. It was Diane's favorite indoor tree. She used to spend her Sunday mornings carefully wiping the dust off its broad leaves. I stood over the terracotta pot for a moment, whispering a quiet apology to my late wife. Then I tipped the crystal glass and poured the entire contents into the dark potting soil. The earth soaked up the red liquid instantly. I took the glass back to the kitchen and scrubbed it with scalding hot water and dish soap until my hands were raw. That night, I did not sleep. I lay awake in the dark, listening to the rain drumming against the roof, running through every structural calculation of my life. I was trying to figure out where I had miscalculated so terribly with my son. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the bedroom blinds, I had no answers, only a cold, hardened resolve. I pushed myself out of bed, my joints aching with the damp weather and the sheer stress of the past 24 hours. I put on my robe and walked down the hallway toward the kitchen to make a pot of black coffee. As I passed through the living room, my eyes instinctively darted toward the bay window. I stopped dead in my tracks. The breath caught in my throat. The ficus plant, which had been vibrant and green just 12 hours earlier, was completely destroyed. The large, glossy leaves had curled inward, shriveling into brittle, blackened husks. Several of them had already fallen off, littering the hardwood floor like dead insects. I walked closer, my heart pounding a heavy rhythm against my ribs. The soil in the terracotta pot looked scorched, emitting a faint, acrid chemical smell that completely overpowered the natural scent of damp earth. Whatever powder they had crushed into my juice was devastatingly corrosive. It was designed to shut down a living organism fast. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. If this substance could obliterate a healthy plant overnight, what would it have done to my 73-year-old stomach? What would it have done to my heart? And then a far more terrifying thought struck me like a physical blow. The juice was just an opportunity. It was a crime of convenience. Bradley and Monica were calculated. They had a timeline. If they wanted me out of the way, they would not rely on a beverage I might refuse. They would target something I consumed every single day without question, something I trusted blindly. I turned away from the dead plant and rushed toward the master bathroom. My bare feet slapped against the cold tile floor. I threw open the medicine cabinet above the sink. My daily pill organizer sat on the glass shelf. Every morning I took a specific beta blocker to manage my blood pressure. It was a small pale blue tablet. I popped open the compartment for Thursday and tipped the pills into the palm of my hand. At first glance, the pale blue pill looked completely normal, but I am an engineer. I pulled open the top drawer of my vanity and took out the illuminated magnifying glass I used for reading small blueprints. I turned on the LED light and held the lens over the blue tablet. Under the harsh magnified light, the deception was glaringly obvious. My prescribed beta blocker had a specific numeric code stamped across the center, and the edges were perfectly smooth. The pill sitting in my hand had no code. It was completely blank, and the edges were slightly chalky, as if manufactured in a different facility. It was not my heart medication. I quickly opened the original prescription bottle sitting in the back of the cabinet. It was completely filled with these counterfeit blank tablets. Someone had meticulously swapped out my life-saving medication. My mind raced back to the previous week, remembering when Monica had stopped by to use my restroom, while Bradley kept me distracted in the garden. She had the perfect opportunity to switch the bottles. I went to my computer, typed in the physical description of the fake pill into a medical database, and waited for the results. When the page loaded, the blood drained from my face. It was a heavy industrial-strength sedative, a highly restricted psychiatric drug used to sedate aggressive patients in mental health wards. If taken daily by an elderly man, it would not kill him immediately. Instead, it would drastically lower his heart rate, cause severe confusion, induce memory loss, and create the exact clinical presentation of rapid-onset dementia. They were not just trying to kill me. They were microdosing me into a state of total mental incompetence. They wanted me locked away in a psychiatric ward, completely incapable of managing my own estate. The sheer, unimaginable, and deeply calculated cruelty of their very sinister plan was absolutely suffocating to my tired, broken soul. I stood in the dark bathroom for a long time, staring at the bottle of heavy sedatives in my hand. The cold white tiles beneath my feet grounded me as the horrifying reality of my situation set in. Bradley and Monica were not just greedy. They were methodical. And if they were methodical enough to swap my daily medication with a psychiatric drug, I had to assume they were monitoring my every move. I walked back to my bedroom and picked up my smartphone. It suddenly felt like a tracking device, a digital spy sitting right inside my own home. I plugged the phone into the charger on my wooden nightstand, turned the volume up, and started playing an hour-long podcast about historical architecture. I left it there, projecting the illusion of a tired old man resting in bed. I went down to the basement and opened my old tool chest. Tucked beneath a pile of rusty wrenches was a prepaid burner phone I had purchased years ago for an out-of-country fishing trip. I powered it on. The battery was low, but it had enough juice for one crucial phone call. I dialed the private cell number of Jonathan Wright. Jonathan was not just my attorney. He was one of my oldest friends, the man who had drafted every legal document for my engineering firm over the last 3 decades. I did not explain anything over the phone. I simply told him it was an absolute emergency, a matter of life and death, and instructed him to meet me in 1 hour at the underground parking garage beneath the old Symphony Hall downtown. I did not take my car. Modern vehicles have too many computer systems, too many ways to be tracked by a tech-savvy hedge fund manager like my son. I put on my heavy raincoat, pulled a wool cap low over my face, and walked 4 blocks in the freezing rain to catch a city bus. The ride into downtown Seattle took 45 minutes. I sat in the very back watching the gray city blur past the rain-streaked windows, clutching a manila envelope containing the fake pills and the flash drive George had given me. When I finally descended the concrete stairs into the underground parking garage, the smell of damp exhaust fumes and old motor oil hit my lungs. It was a cavernous, dimly lit bunker. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows across the wet pavement. The deafening echo of car tires screeching against the concrete provided the perfect acoustic cover for a private conversation. Nobody could eavesdrop down here. I walked past rows of parked vehicles until I saw Jonathan standing beside his silver sedan in the deepest corner of the third sublevel. He was wearing a tailored wool overcoat, shivering slightly in the damp cold, clutching a thick leather briefcase to his chest. When he saw me approach, his face contorted with deep concern. "Rick, my God, you look terrible," Jonathan said, stepping forward to shake my hand. "What in the world is going on? Why are we meeting in a freezing parking garage instead of my office?" I did not waste time with pleasantries. I reached into my pocket and handed him the small plastic bag containing the counterfeit pill. I told him what it was. I told him about the dead ficus plant, the white powder on the crystal glass of pomegranate juice, and the agonizing video file safely stored on the encrypted flash drive in my coat pocket. As I spoke, Jonathan's face went from pale to completely ashen. His professional composure shattered. He leaned back against the hood of his car, breathing heavily, taking off his glasses to rub his eyes. He stood there in absolute silence for a full minute, absorbing the magnitude of the evil I had just described. When he finally looked back up at me, his eyes were filled with a mixture of profound sorrow and absolute terror. He unlatched his leather briefcase with trembling fingers. "Rick," he said, his voice barely rising above the low hum of the garage ventilation system. "I have spent the last 3 days trying to figure out how to tell you this. I thought it was just a terrible misunderstanding. But after what you just told me about the video, everything makes a horrifying amount of sense." He pulled out a stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper and handed them to me. The harsh fluorescent light above us illuminated the bold legal text. I looked at the top page. It was a transfer of assets agreement. I asked Jonathan what I was looking at. He took a deep, shaky breath. 5 days before Diane passed away, these documents were filed with the county clerk, he explained. This document legally dissolved your joint ownership of the primary estate. Your $12 million estate, which includes your liquid retirement savings and your shares in the commercial real estate firm, was split. And Diane's entire $6 million was immediately transferred into a private, irrevocable trust. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It was Diane's handwriting. But I knew my wife. I knew she would never do something like this behind my back. I asked Jonathan who controlled this irrevocable trust. Jonathan looked me dead in the eye, and the final piece of the devastating puzzle snapped violently into place. "Bradley controls it," he said. "He is the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. Diane supposedly signed away her entire life savings to him, effectively cutting you out completely just 5 days before her heart failed. They did not just kill her for sheer convenience, Rick. They killed her for $6 million in cold, hard cash. And if they are trying to drug you into a state of permanent dementia, it is because they desperately need to take legal control of your remaining half next." I stared at the piece of paper in my trembling hands, my eyes locked on the ink that formed my late wife's name. Diane. The cursive loops were identical to the way she had signed every birthday card, tax return, and mortgage document for the last 40 years. To a county clerk processing hundreds of forms a day, it would look flawless. To a probate judge casually glancing over a legal brief, it would pass without a second thought. But they were not structural engineers. I spent my entire career analyzing stress points, weight distribution, and the physical impact of force on different materials. When you draft blueprints by hand, as I did for decades before computers took over the industry, you learn a lot about the pressure of a pen. You learn how ink behaves when a hand hesitates. I ran my index finger over the back of the thick bond paper. I could feel the deep raised grooves where the pen had pressed into the page. Diane had a delicate handwriting. She barely pressed down on the paper when she wrote, leaving a smooth, unbroken surface on the reverse side. This signature, however, was carved into the document with heavy, deliberate force. The person who signed this was trying too hard to perfectly match the loops and slants. They were concentrating so intensely on tracing the shape of the letters that they pushed the ballpoint pen deep into the fibers of the page. It was a mechanical reproduction, devoid of the natural flowing rhythm of my wife's hand. I looked back up at Jonathan. The air in the underground garage felt colder than before. I told him the signature was a forgery. I explained the pressure points, the hesitation marks visible only under close inspection, and the sheer impossibility of Diane gripping a pen with that much force in the final days of her life, when her arthritis had flared up so badly she could barely hold her teacup. Jonathan nodded slowly, his expression grim. He did not doubt me for a single second. He knew Diane just as well as I did. But he was not finished delivering the devastating news. He reached back into his leather briefcase and pulled out another manila folder. The folder looked heavier than the first one. He hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to shield me from whatever poison was waiting inside those pages. "Rick," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "If the forged trust agreement was the motive for Diane's death, this next document is the blueprint for yours." He handed me the folder. I opened it carefully, half expecting the paper to burn my fingers. It was an insurance policy, a massive life insurance policy taken out on my life 3 months ago. I scanned the bold print at the top of the page. The death benefit was staggering. $5 million. My eyes darted down the page to find the listed beneficiary. It was not my son. The sole beneficiary of the $5 million payout was Monica. Bradley had clearly structured it this way to keep his own name clean, using his wife as the financial vessel to collect the blood money. But the true horror of the document was not the amount or the beneficiary. It was the clauses buried deep in the fine print. I have dealt with insurance companies my entire professional life negotiating liability coverage for construction projects. I know how to read the fine print. Jonathan pointed a shaking finger at a highlighted paragraph near the bottom of the 3rd page. "Read the conditions of the payout," he instructed, his voice thick with disgust. I read the words aloud, my voice echoing slightly against the concrete pillars of the parking garage. The policy guarantees a full payout only in the event of death by natural causes or fatal accidental injury, resulting directly from documented mental decline. I stopped reading. The words hung in the damp air like a death sentence. Suddenly, every single piece of their twisted, malicious puzzle locked together with terrifying precision. The counterfeit pills in my medicine cabinet, the heavy sedatives designed to destroy my cognitive function, the fake smiles and the organic pomegranate juice laced with corrosive powder. It all made perfect sense now. If they simply shot me or pushed me down a flight of stairs, the police would investigate. The insurance company would launch a fraud inquiry, and the payout would be frozen indefinitely. But if a 73-year-old man suffering from rapid-onset dementia accidentally wandered out into the freezing Seattle rain and died of exposure, no one would ask any questions. If an old man whose mind had been chemically erased by stolen psychiatric drugs accidentally slipped in his bathtub or drove his car into a concrete embankment, it would be ruled a tragic but natural consequence of his mental decline. The insurance company would write the $5 million check without batting an eye. Monica would deposit the money, Bradley would pay off his debts, and they would live happily ever after in the luxury home I helped them buy, built on the graves of my wife and myself. They had constructed a perfectly legal, undetectable murder plot. It was a masterpiece of financial and medical manipulation. I closed the manila folder and handed it back to Jonathan. The trembling in my own hands had stopped. The crushing weight of the betrayal was still there, sitting heavy on my chest, but it was no longer paralyzing me. It was fueling me. I asked Jonathan what their next move was going to be. If they were drugging me to fake a mental decline, they needed to make that decline legally official before they could stage the fatal accident. Jonathan took a deep, shaky breath, tightly clutching his heavy leather briefcase against his chest, and prepared to deliver the absolute final crushing blow to my already shattered world. Jonathan reached into the side compartment of his briefcase and pulled out one last document. It was a thin stack of papers. He looked at me with profound sadness. "Rick," He began, his voice barely a whisper. This is the mechanism they will use to trigger the insurance policy. This was filed yesterday morning with the King County Superior Court. It is a formal petition for an emergency conservatorship. I frowned, the legal term echoing in my mind. A conservatorship. I knew what it meant, but hearing it applied to my own life felt surreal. I asked him to explain what Bradley was claiming. Jonathan looked down at the paper. Bradley submitted an affidavit backed by a preliminary medical statement claiming you are suffering from severe Alzheimer's disease. He is telling the court you are a danger to yourself, incapable of managing your finances, and lack the cognitive ability to make medical decisions. The sheer audacity of the lie took my breath away. Bradley was using the disease I feared for Diane as a weapon against me. But Jonathan was not finished. He stepped closer, his expression hardening with urgency. Rick, you need to understand the gravity of this petition. If the judge grants this conservatorship, you will legally cease to exist as an independent adult. You will be stripped of your rights. You will not be allowed to drive. You will not be allowed to vote. You will not be able to withdraw a single dollar from your bank accounts, and you cannot choose your doctor. Jonathan paused to let the reality sink in. Bradley will have absolute authority over every aspect of your existence, he continued. He can lock you in a psychiatric facility against your will. He can force you to take those heavy sedatives under the guise of medical treatment. He can isolate you so no one can hear you scream. They scheduled the emergency hearing in exactly 14 days. 2 weeks, Rick. That is the ticking clock. In 14 days, Bradley walks into that courtroom and erases your freedom. A heavy silence fell between us. The damp air of the garage felt suffocating. For a brief, terrifying moment, the image of a sterile psychiatric ward flashed in my mind. I pictured myself trapped in a small room, drugged, unable to speak, waiting for the fatal accident that Monica's insurance policy required. It was a fate worse than a quick death. It was a prolonged torture designed to strip away my dignity before discarding my body. Jonathan gripped my shoulder. His hand was trembling. Rick, we have to act right now, he pleaded. We need to get you out of that house immediately. I can arrange a secure hotel for you under an assumed name. We will hire independent medical experts to evaluate your cognitive health tomorrow morning to counter their fraudulent claims. We can go to the police with the video of Diane. It might not be enough for a murder conviction, but it will throw a wrench into the conservatorship hearing. We have to run, Rick. We have to get you to safety. I looked at my oldest friend. I saw the genuine terror in his eyes, the desperate desire to protect me. I slowly removed his hand from my shoulder. I turned my gaze away and looked out across the dark, echoing expanse of the underground garage. I did not feel the urge to run. I did not feel the urge to hide in some anonymous hotel room while my son dismantled my life and desecrated my wife's memory. The fear that had gripped me earlier was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. I stood up perfectly straight, letting my 73 years command the space between us. I am not running, Jonathan, I said, my voice steady and resonant. I am not hiding in a hotel room, and I am not giving that monster the satisfaction of seeing me retreat. For 40 years, I worked in a profession that required absolute precision, relentless focus, and a complete understanding of structural weaknesses. I built skyscrapers, Jonathan. I laid the foundations for towers that touch the clouds. I know exactly how much pressure a support beam can take before it snaps. Jonathan stared at me, completely stunned by the sudden shift in my demeanor. I took a step closer, my eyes burning with unyielding resolve. I have spent my entire life building things up. I continued, the words flowing from me with icy clarity. I built a business. I built a fortune. I built a family. I thought I had built a legacy. But the foundation of that legacy is rotten, and the architects of that rot are sleeping soundly, thinking they have already won. They think I am just a weak, grieving old man who will quietly slip into the shadows of a psychiatric ward. I pulled out the encrypted flash drive, holding it like a physical weapon. "They are wrong," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "I am not going to let them erase me. I am going to use these next 14 days to map out every single crack in their foundation. I am going to find out who they are working with, how they forged those documents, and what they plan to do next. I am going to let them walk into that courtroom believing they have the upper hand." Jonathan swallowed hard, awe and fear washing over his face. "What are you saying?" he whispered. "I am saying that we are not going to play defense," I replied. "We are going to let them build their little house of cards all the way to the top. And then, when the entire world is watching, I am going to rip the foundation right out from under them. I built skyscrapers, Jonathan. Now I am going to demolish one. And I am going to make sure Bradley is standing on the top floor when it falls." I left the underground parking garage and took the bus back to my empty neighborhood. My mind was no longer clouded by grief or confusion. It was running with the cold, mechanical precision of a project manager coordinating a major demolition. I did not go to the police. I did not seek out a private investigator from the Yellow Pages. I needed someone who operated entirely outside the boundaries of the law, someone who could turn my home into an invisible fortress without leaving a single paper trail. Through a contact I had made years ago during a corporate espionage dispute at my engineering firm, I reached out to an underground cybersecurity expert. He went by the name Elias. He was expensive, he demanded to be paid in untraceable cryptocurrency, and he promised absolute discretion. I told him to meet me at my house at 2 a.m. Bradley and Monica believed I was dutifully taking my nightly sedatives. They thought I was currently lying in my bed, lost in a chemically induced fog, entirely unaware of my surroundings. They were completely wrong. I was wide awake, standing by the back door in the pitch-black kitchen, waiting for the shadow to arrive. At exactly 2 o'clock, a soft knock echoed against the heavy oak frame of the kitchen door. I opened it to find Elias standing in the pouring rain. He was dressed entirely in black, carrying 2 heavy reinforced tactical cases. He did not say a word. He stepped inside, wiped his boots on the mat, and gave me a curt nod. I locked the deadbolt behind him. The house was dead silent save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the roof shingles. I had built this house from the ground up 30 years ago. I poured the concrete foundation. I framed the walls. I drove every single nail into the floorboards with my own 2 hands. I designed it to be a sanctuary for my wife and my son. A place where the harshness of the outside world could never reach them. As I watched Elias open his cases, revealing tangles of fiber optic wires, microscopic lenses, and advanced listening devices, a profound sense of sorrow washed over me. I was violating the sanctity of my own home. But I had no choice. The sanctuary had already been breached. The monsters were not outside. They had the keys to the front door. I guided Elias into the formal dining room. The space was dominated by a massive imported crystal chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling. I remember the weekend I installed that chandelier. Diane stood at the bottom of the ladder, her hands pressed nervously against her cheeks, warning me to be careful as I hoisted the heavy brass fixture into place. Now Elias stood on that very same ladder. He carefully unscrewed a decorative crystal teardrop and replaced it with a flawless acrylic replica containing a 360-degree high-definition camera. He ran a hair-thin wire up the heavy brass chain, splicing it directly into the main power line. Next, we moved into the grand foyer. Flanking the front entrance were 2 heavy bronze statues of rearing horses I had purchased from an estate sale in London. Elias pulled a high-speed precision drill from his case. The sound of the drill biting into the thick metal was agonizingly loud in the quiet house. But I knew the heavy insulation I had installed in the walls would muffle the noise from the street. He hollowed out the dark eyes of the horses and inserted microscopic lenses. Every person who walked through my front door would now be watched by the cold, unblinking eyes of those bronze figures. From there, we moved through the hallways and the living room. Elias dismantled the smoke detectors I had meticulously wired into the ceiling 20 years ago to keep my family safe from fire. Inside the plastic housing of each detector, he planted military-grade omnidirectional microphones capable of picking up a whisper from 40 feet away. I watched him work with a detached clinical fascination. I traced my fingers along the smooth, sanded edge of the mahogany doorframe. I remembered sanding that wood until my hands blistered, wanting everything to be perfect for Bradley's childhood home. I had spent decades trying to protect him from the world. I had built walls to keep him safe. Now I was lacing those same walls with digital tripwires to catch him in the act of destroying me. The irony was a bitter pill harder to swallow than the fake sedatives sitting in my bathroom cabinet. I was turning the monument of my family's love into an execution chamber for my only child. By 5 in the morning, the installation was complete. Elias had transformed the dusty, unfinished root cellar in my basement into a state-of-the-art command center. 2 large curved monitors sat on a folding table, glowing brightly in the damp darkness. I sat down in the creaky wooden chair in front of the screens. Elias handed me a small, encrypted tablet. He explained that all the video and audio feeds were routed through a highly secure server located in a safe jurisdiction. I swiped my right index finger across the cold glass screen of the tablet. Instantly, the monitors flared to life. The dining room, the foyer, the living room, and the kitchen were displayed in high-definition video. Even in the pitch black of the early morning, the infrared sensors illuminated every corner with a ghostly green glow. Elias packed his bags, collected his payment, and vanished into the rainy dawn as quietly as he arrived. I sat alone in the basement, watching the silent feeds of my empty house. Bradley thought I was a ghost, fading away into dementia. But as I stared at the monitors, I realized the absolute truth. I was that ghost, and I saw everything. For 3 days, my life became a masterclass in deception. I maintained the posture of a man whose mind was slipping into dementia. When Bradley and Monica visited, I purposely forgot their names. I misplaced my keys in the refrigerator. I stared blankly at the dark television. Playing the victim, I saw triumph in my son's eyes. They thought the sedatives worked perfectly. They thought they had broken me. When their car left the driveway, the act dropped. I locked the doors, drew the curtains, and descended into my basement command center. I spent hours watching recorded feeds, listening to conversations, waiting for a slip. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. The rain paused, leaving a suffocating humidity. Bradley arrived unannounced. I was in the basement when the bronze horse caught his key in the lock. I froze, holding my breath, as the camera tracked his movement. He did not call my name. He did not check if I slept. He moved quickly into the dining room, his shoes echoing against the hardwood. He paced furiously beneath the crystal chandelier, unaware a high-definition camera tracked his every step. His pale face glistened with cold sweat, his hands trembling uncontrollably. This was not the arrogant predator from the video of my wife's death. This was a man who was fundamentally terrified. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket and dialed. The microscopic microphone hidden inside the smoke detector amplified the audio with terrifying clarity. I reached over and adjusted the volume dial on the mixing board, making sure I would not miss a single syllable. The phone rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered on the other end. Bradley did not even wait for a greeting. He just started pleading. "I told you I need more time," Bradley said, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "I am doing everything exactly as we agreed. The medical records are being altered right now. The conservatorship hearing is set for next week. Once the judge signs the order, the life insurance policy becomes fully actionable." The man on the phone let out a slow, menacing laugh. The sound chilled me to the bone. "We do not care about your court dates, Bradley," the voice replied with chilling indifference. "You owe the outfit $8 million. You promised us the first installment last month, and you came up short. Your little hedge fund is a complete crater. You lost our money playing high-stakes games you did not understand. Now the bill is entirely due." Bradley stopped pacing. He leaned against the heavy oak dining table, running a shaking hand through his hair. "I know," he whispered frantically. "I know I messed up the fund. But I fixed the first half of the problem, did I not? I got you the $6 million from my mother's trust. I did what had to be done. It was not easy, but I handled it. Give me a little credit for that." The blood drained entirely from my face. My heart hammered against my ribs like a sledgehammer. He was admitting it. He was confessing to his own mother's murder over an open cellular line to a loan shark. He had killed Diane to liquidate her $6 million share of our estate, using it to pay down a massive debt to a Chicago crime syndicate. But $6 million was not $8 million. He was still $2 million short, and the mafia was not known for their forgiveness. That is exactly why they had taken out the $5 million insurance policy on my life. The voice on the phone cut through Bradley's desperate excuses. "We do not give credit for partial payments," the man sneered. "You still owe us $2 million plus interest, and our patience is completely gone. You have exactly 30 days, Bradley. 30 days from today. If the rest of the money is not in our offshore account by the end of the month, we are not going to bother calling you again. We will just send someone to your lovely home in Lincoln Park, and we will take it out of your hide. Do you understand me?" Bradley was practically hyperventilating now. "Yes," he gasped. "Yes, I understand. I will have the money. My old man is fading fast. The sedatives are doing their job. He will have an accident soon, a tragic fall or something, and the policy will pay out $5 million. You will get every single penny I owe you. Just please call off your guys. Give me the 30 days. The line went dead. Bradley collapsed into one of the dining room chairs, dropping his phone onto the table. He buried his face in his hands and let out a long, ragged sob. I sat in the darkness of the basement, staring at the monitor. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal washed over me like a tidal wave of shattered glass. My son was not just a greedy, entitled child waiting for an inheritance. He was a desperate, cornered animal. His hedge fund had collapsed under the weight of his own profound arrogance, and he had borrowed money from the worst people imaginable to cover his tracks. He had sacrificed his own mother to save his own skin. And now I was the final pawn in his pathetic game of survival. If I died, he lived. It was that simple. The 30-day deadline hung in the air, a ticking time bomb attached directly to my chest. But as I watched him weeping over his own miserable fate, I realized that Bradley had made one catastrophic miscalculation. He thought he was playing the game against a helpless, dementia-ridden old man. He did not know he was actually playing against a structural engineer who had just mapped out every single stress fracture in his miserable, collapsing life. He had 30 days to kill me. But I only needed 14 days to bury him forever. The next morning, the doorbell chimed, shattering the silence. I was already awake, having spent the night reviewing the audio file from my basement command center. I walked slowly up the stairs, shuffling my feet and slumping my shoulders, slipping back into the role of the frail old man. When I opened the door, Bradley was standing on the porch, holding a box of expensive pastries. If I had not seen him practically hyperventilating with terror just yesterday on the hidden cameras, I would have thought he was the most put-together man in Seattle. His dark suit was immaculately tailored. His hair was perfectly styled against the morning wind. He wore a calm, reassuring smile, but knowing what I now knew, I could easily see the subtle, desperate cracks in his facade. The dark circles under his eyes were heavily concealed by cosmetic makeup. There was a slight, nervous twitch in his jaw. The desperate energy was vibrating just beneath his skin like bridge cables strained to the absolute breaking point. He stepped inside and kissed my cheek, a Judas kiss if there ever was one, and guided me gently toward the kitchen. He made a fresh pot of coffee and beautifully plated the pastries on a silver tray, talking enthusiastically about the weather and his supposed financial successes at work. I sat quietly at the marble kitchen island, offering slow, confused nods, playing my part to absolute perfection. After pouring me a hot cup of black coffee, he pulled up a tall stool and gently took my hand. His skin felt unnaturally cold and clammy against mine. "Dad," he began, his voice taking on a soft, theatrical tone of deep mourning. "Next Saturday would have been your and Mom's 45th wedding anniversary. I know how hard these milestones are, especially the very first one without her here with us. I have been thinking about it a lot, and Monica and I want to do something truly special to honor her wonderful memory. We want to host a grand anniversary memorial party right here at the house." He gestured broadly around the room, painting a picture of an elegant evening. A celebration of her life with all our friends, extended family, and the people who respected her most. "We will handle all the catering and the decorations. You will not have to lift a finger. We just want to fill this empty house with love and support for you." I stared down at the dark reflection in my coffee mug, purposely forcing a slight pathetic tremor into my hands. To anyone else looking at this scene, it would sound like the ultimate gesture of a loving son trying to bring comfort to his grieving father. But I was an engineer, and I immediately began looking for the hidden structural flaw in his generous proposal. Why host it here in my house instead of a rented banquet hall? Why next Saturday, just 3 days before the scheduled emergency conservatorship hearing? I looked up at him with vacant eyes and asked who he was planning to invite. Bradley smiled, clearly relieved that I was not putting up a stubborn fight. "Oh, just a wonderful group of people," he said smoothly, taking a sip of his coffee. "Some of your old senior colleagues from the engineering firm, the core board members from the charity Mom loved so much, and a few of my close professional associates from the city. For example, Judge Harrison will be attending. He is a good friend of my firm, and he always admired Mom's philanthropic work. He specifically asked if he could come pay his respects." Judge Harrison. The name hit my ears like a devastating physical blow, though I did not let a single muscle in my face betray my horrifying realization. Jonathan had warned me just 2 days ago in the underground garage. Judge Harrison was the exact magistrate assigned to preside over the emergency conservatorship petition Bradley had quietly filed. The scattered puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying, brilliant clarity. This was not a loving memorial. This was a carefully orchestrated theater production, and I was intended to be the tragic star attraction. The Chicago Mafia had given Bradley a strict 30-day deadline to pay the remaining $2 million. He could not afford to wait for me to slowly deteriorate from the fake beta blockers over several months. He needed to accelerate the timeline immediately. He needed the conservatorship granted right now, so he could legally seize control of my assets and then arrange my fatal accidental death to collect the $5 million insurance policy. But judges can be highly unpredictable. Sometimes they order independent medical evaluations. Sometimes they delay their rulings for weeks. Bradley could not afford a single delay. He needed the judge to see my supposed insanity with his own 2 eyes. I realized his plan. Next Saturday, my home would be filled with Seattle's elite, my former colleagues, and the one man who held the power to strip away my human rights. During the party, surrounded by witnesses, Bradley and Monica were going to drug me. Not with the slow-acting sedatives they had been slipping into my medicine cabinet, but with something fast, aggressive, and highly hallucinogenic. They would serve me a poisoned drink laced with a chemical that would cause a severe public psychotic break. They wanted the judge to watch me lose my mind in the middle of my own living room. They wanted me screaming at ghosts, knocking over tables, and appearing completely disconnected from reality. A breakdown of that magnitude would instantly eliminate any doubt in the judge's mind. The conservatorship would be granted the next morning without a second thought. I looked at my son, the desperate animal smiling warmly at me across the island, and gave him a slow, grateful nod. I told him it was a beautiful idea. I told him his mother would have loved it. The days leading up to the party were a whirlwind of fabricated affection and meticulously planned chaos. By late Friday afternoon, my house was overrun. Caterers marched through the doors carrying silver chafing dishes and crates of champagne. Florists arranged bouquets of white lilies on every available surface. Bradley and Monica directed the crew, acting like they already owned the property. I wandered through the bustling hallways, shuffling my feet, occasionally asking the same questions twice to maintain my illusion of a failing mind. Monica would pat my arm with condescending sweetness, guiding me out of the way of the workers. At 3 in the afternoon, I rubbed my eyes, feigned an exhausted yawn, and said I needed a long nap. They rushed me toward the stairs, eager to have the old man out of the way. But I did not go to my bedroom. I slipped down the back staircase and locked myself inside the basement command center. I sat down in the creaky wooden chair and activated the tablet. The monitors flared to life, dividing my home into high-definition grids. I watched Bradley arguing with a caterer over the temporary bar. But my eyes were immediately drawn to Monica. She was standing in the foyer, her head on a swivel, checking the sightlines of the hallway. Satisfied the workers were occupied, she slipped off her designer heels. She moved with practiced, silent steps up the grand staircase. My heart rate quickened as I tracked her progress from the hallway camera to the upstairs landing. She paused outside my master bedroom. She gently pressed her ear against the heavy mahogany door, listening for any sounds of a sleeping man. When she heard only silence, she slowly turned the brass handle and stepped inside my private sanctuary. The camera Elias had cleverly hidden inside the bedroom smoke detector captured her every move in stunning 4,000-pixel resolution. The infrared sensor bathed her in a sharp, ghostly light, highlighting the cold, predatory focus on her face. She did not hesitate. She did not cast a guilty glance around the room. She walked with absolute chilling purpose directly toward my walk-in closet. Hidden behind a row of my winter coats was a heavy steel wall safe. It was where I kept my vital documents, my passport, the deed to the house, and a comprehensive file containing my complete medical history. I watched as she reached behind the coats, her manicured fingers resting on the digital keypad. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath caught in my throat. How could she possibly know the combination? I had never written it down. I had never spoken it aloud. And then a sickening memory flashed in my mind. 3 months ago, shortly after the funeral of Diane, Monica had insisted on helping me organize some insurance papers. She had stood right beside me holding a cup of tea, perfectly positioned to watch my fingers punch the 6-digit code. She had memorized it, filing it away for this exact moment. On the screen, she typed the numbers with rapid, confident precision. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. She reached inside and pulled out the large, thick manila folder full of my private medical records. Inside that folder were the results of a comprehensive neurological evaluation I had voluntarily undergone just 2 months prior, a precautionary measure after losing my wife. The documents legally certified that I possessed the cognitive function of a man 20 years my junior. My memory was flawless, my reasoning was sharp, and there was absolutely zero evidence of dementia. Monica opened the folder quickly, verifying the contents. Then she unzipped her oversized leather tote bag. She pulled out a nearly identical manila folder. I watched as she swapped the documents. She stuffed my genuine clean medical records deep into her bag, effectively erasing the legal proof of my sanity. In their place, she slipped the forged documents into my safe. I did not need to read the papers to know exactly what they said. They were the fraudulent evaluations Bradley had purchased from the corrupt doctor, officially diagnosing me with a highly aggressive terminal memory disease. They detailed a tragic history of paranoia, severe memory loss, and unpredictable outbursts. If the judge demanded proof of my mental decline during the conservatorship, hearing Bradley would simply point to my own safe. The authorities would open it, find the forged documents, and conclude that I had locked them away in a state of paranoid denial. It was a brilliantly evil maneuver, designed to use my own security measures against me. Monica carefully closed the heavy steel door of the safe, ensuring the electronic lock engaged with a solid beep. She adjusted the row of winter coats to perfectly conceal the metal keypad, erasing any trace of her intrusion. She slipped her shoes back onto her feet, smoothed out the wrinkles in her expensive dress, and walked out of the master bedroom with the calm, casual demeanor of a woman who had just finished arranging a vase of flowers. She had no idea that every single second of her federal crime had been meticulously captured, time-stamped, and automatically uploaded to an encrypted offshore server. I sat back in the darkness of the basement, my hands resting calmly on the folding table. I did not feel the crushing weight of betrayal anymore. The shock had completely burned away, leaving behind a pure, crystallized focus. They had forged the signature. They had bought the poison. Now they had planted the false evidence. The timeline was fully established, and the stage was perfectly set for their final act. I reached over and tapped the screen of the tablet, saving the high-resolution video file into a newly created folder. I titled it with her name. The trap was fully closed. Now all I had to do was wait for the party to begin and watch them walk right into it. I did not leave the basement for the rest of the evening. I sat in the dim light of the monitors, the silence of the underground room pressing heavily against my shoulders. Upstairs, the house was filled with the sounds of preparations, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of voices. They were building a stage for my destruction, but down here I was arming a devastating countermeasure. Just past midnight, my burner phone vibrated against the wooden table. It was a single encrypted text message from Elias. The message contained only a string of numbers, an IP address, and a complex decryption key. I quickly typed the credentials into my secure tablet. A loading screen appeared, replaced seconds later by a vast, organized directory of digital files. Elias had not just cracked Bradley's personal devices. He had bypassed the firewalls of my son's offshore financial servers. He had struck the absolute jackpot. I opened the first folder labeled with the name of a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. My eyes scanned the lines of code and text, translating the complex financial jargon into a horrifyingly clear narrative. Bradley had been running a massive Ponzi scheme through his venture capital firm, and when the market turned, he had desperately sought liquidity from the worst possible source. I clicked on a subfolder containing months of archived email correspondence. These were not the polished professional emails of a successful hedge fund manager. They were frantic, desperate messages sent over a heavily encrypted network to a server located in downtown Chicago. I read through the exchanges, feeling a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The syndicate did not use names, only numerical designations, but their intent was brutally clear. They had loaned Bradley $8 million to cover his catastrophic trading losses under the strict condition of an extortionate interest rate and a rigid repayment schedule. When Bradley missed his first major deadline, the tone of the emails shifted from professional threats to explicit promises of violence. One email dated just 3 weeks before Diane passed away explicitly detailed what they would do to Monica if the money was not delivered. The terror in Bradley's responses was palpable. He begged for more time. He promised them a massive influx of capital. He outlined his plan to liquidate a substantial family asset to cover the initial $6 million. Reading his words, I realized he had bargained his mother's life to buy himself a temporary pardon. He had traded her existence for a brief reprieve from the monsters he had invited into his life. But the most damning evidence was not in the emails. It was in the ledgers. I opened a massive spreadsheet tracking offshore wire transfers. My eyes followed the rows of numbers tracing the flow of illicit funds across international borders. I found the transfer of $6 million, the exact amount stolen from Diane's trust, routed directly into the syndicate's holding account just 2 days after her funeral. But right beneath that transaction was another wire transfer. This one was much smaller, exactly $250,000 sent from Bradley's personal offshore account to a private bank in Switzerland. I traced the routing number, matching it to an encrypted invoice Elias had managed to intercept. The invoice was billed to a consulting firm owned by a local Seattle physician. I stared at the name on the screen. Dr. Aris Thorne. It was the exact same doctor who had arrived at our house the night Diane died. The man who had signed her death certificate confidently ruling her passing as a natural myocardial infarction, thereby completely avoiding a mandatory autopsy. Bradley had not just let his mother die on the floor. He had paid a corrupt medical professional $250,000 to look the other way, to legally sanitize the murder, and to pave the way for his massive financial windfall. The absolute depravity of the entire criminal conspiracy was truly staggering to comprehend. I leaned back in my creaky chair, the harsh glow of the monitors casting long shadows across the damp concrete walls. Every single piece of this massive twisted puzzle was now resting in the palm of my hand. I had the horrifying video of Bradley and Monica standing over my dying wife. I had the clear audio recording of his desperate confession to the violent loan shark. I had the high-definition footage of Monica planting the forged medical records in my personal safe. And now I finally possessed the indisputable financial records, proving the ruthless extortion, the theft and the bribery of a medical official. I began to compile the files. I created a master digital dossier organizing the evidence into a clear, undeniable timeline of their crimes. I meticulously formatted the documents, ensuring the wire transfers, the emails, and the videos were seamlessly linked together in a presentation that no judge, no jury, and no defense attorney could ever dismantle. I backed up the entire folder to 3 separate secure offshore servers and downloaded a final copy onto the heavy black flash drive sitting on my desk. I closed the laptop. The net was completely drawn. The trap was locked. I sat in the darkness listening to the faint sounds of the party preparations continuing above me. Bradley thought he had orchestrated the perfect crime. He thought tomorrow night would be his ultimate victory. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the man he was trying to destroy. I closed my eyes and made a silent vow to the memory of my wife. I would let them have their grand party. I would let them gather their powerful friends, their corrupt doctor, and their unsuspecting judge. I would let them raise their glasses in a toast to their own brilliant deception. And then when they were standing at the very peak of their arrogance, I would unleash a storm that would wipe their names from the face of the earth. The house was finally completely quiet. The caterers had left hours ago, and the massive floral arrangements sat in the dark dining room, like decorations for a beautiful, wealthy tomb. Every shadow in the hallway felt heavy with the anticipation of the coming storm. I stood in the foyer staring at the hidden camera in the bronze horse before I finally turned to leave. I put on my heavy wool coat and grabbed the keys to my old rusted pickup truck, the one I kept parked behind the garage. I did not take my daily driver. I needed to move through the city unseen, a ghost slipping through the heavy Seattle fog. The silent drive to the cemetery took exactly 20 minutes. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a thick, suffocating mist that clung to the streetlights and rolled across the wet pavement. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of the memorial park. The grounds were completely deserted. The only sound was the crunch of my heavy boots against the damp gravel path as I made my way toward the eastern slope. I found her headstone easily. Even in the dark, my internal compass always pointed toward Diane. I stood at the foot of her grave, looking down at the smooth granite slab. The street lamp near the perimeter wall cast a faint pale light across the carved letters of her name. I did not drop to my knees. I did not weep. I had shed all my tears in the weeks following her funeral, when I still believed her heart had simply given out. The man standing over her grave tonight was entirely empty of sorrow. I was filled only with a cold, absolute resolve. I spoke to her not out loud, but in the quiet sanctuary of my own mind. I told her everything I had uncovered. I laid out the horrible truth of her final moments, the staggering depth of our son's betrayal, and the meticulously planned trap I had constructed in our basement. I asked her for forgiveness, not for what I was about to do to Bradley, but for my profound failure as a father. For 40 years, I believed that providing for my family was the ultimate expression of love. I built a financial fortress around them. I gave Bradley every conceivable advantage. I paid for his mistakes. I shielded him from the consequences of his arrogance, and I paved a perfectly smooth road for his ambitions. I thought I was being a good father, but as a structural engineer, I should have known the fundamental law of materials. Steel only becomes strong when it is subjected to intense heat and immense pressure. If you shelter a material from all friction, it becomes brittle. It looks solid on the surface, but the moment it bears any real weight, it shatters. I had raised a brittle man. I had created a monster of entitlement and cowardice, a creature who loved money more than he loved the woman who gave him life. And now that monster was coming to devour me. The fog rolled over the grass, brushing against the ankles of my boots. I thought about the first time I held Bradley in the delivery room. He was so small, so entirely dependent on me. I had promised the universe that I would protect him from every danger in the world. I never imagined that one day he would become the danger. The philosophy of fatherhood is a strange, agonizing burden. We are biologically wired to preserve our offspring at all costs. To turn against your own flesh and blood feels like a violation of the natural order. It goes against every instinct stitched into my DNA. But true morality is not bound by genetics. Blood makes you related, but it does not excuse murder. Blood does not grant you the right to watch your mother suffocate on a living room rug while you check your watch. I realized standing there that justice and family were no longer compatible. To serve one, I had to completely obliterate the other. If I let Bradley walk away, if I just handed him the money and faded into the background, I would be an accomplice to Diane's murder. I would be validating his evil. I could not allow that. I had to become the very consequence I had shielded him from his entire life. I crouched down and pressed my bare hand against the cold, wet granite of her headstone. It felt solid, permanent, unyielding. I made her a promise. I promised her that her death would not be the foundation of his wealth. I promised her that the corrupt doctor who signed away her truth would lose everything he valued. I promised her that the judge who was supposed to strip away my freedom would instead be the witness to my son's absolute destruction. The weight of this vow settled onto my shoulders, heavy but incredibly grounding. I was no longer a grieving widower or a confused, frightened old man hiding in the shadows. I was the deliberate architect of a terrible, righteous retribution. I slowly stood back up and quietly looked out at the dark horizon. The city of Seattle glowed faintly through the mist, a sprawling network of concrete, steel, and fragile human lives. Somewhere out there, Bradley was probably sleeping soundly, dreaming of his imminent salvation. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet was already gone. I turned away from the grave and walked back down the gravel path toward my truck. The freezing cold night air filled my lungs, feeling incredibly sharp and deeply invigorating. Tomorrow night, my beautiful house would be full of bright light, loud music, and laughter. Tomorrow night, the elites of the city would gather to toast a lie. And tomorrow night, I would burn their entire wicked empire down to the ground, leaving nothing behind but the absolute undeniable truth for everyone to see. Saturday evening arrived, wrapping the city of Seattle in a cold, relentless downpour that forced the valet drivers to sprint back and forth across my long, circular driveway. I stood alone on the upper landing of the grand staircase, watching the heavy oak front doors open and close. Each time the brass hinges swung, a new cluster of high society stepped into the warm, brilliantly lit foyer. Women in expensive silk dresses and men in tailored evening jackets handed their dripping umbrellas to the waiting staff. A professional string quartet played a soft, melancholy classical piece in the corner of the expansive living room, perfectly setting the somber, respectful tone my son had requested. It was a masterfully directed stage play, complete with expensive catered appetizers and top-shelf liquor. Everyone in the room believed they were attending a beautiful, tragic memorial to honor the memory of my late wife. But as I looked down at the growing sea of faces from my vantage point on the stairs, I did not see grieving friends paying their respects. I saw the unwitting audience for an execution. I adjusted the stiff cuffs of my dark suit, forcing my hands to adopt that familiar pathetic tremor, and began my incredibly slow descent into the belly of the beast. Bradley was already actively working the center of the room, playing his part to absolute perfection. He held a half-empty glass of scotch in one hand, using his free hand to pat the shoulders of older, wealthier men. He projected the exact image of a dutiful, heartbroken son desperately trying to hold his shattered family together. I shuffled past a group of my former engineering partners, offering them a weak, confused smile when they leaned in to express their deepest condolences. I did not want to speak to them. I needed to identify the key players in my son's deadly game. I needed to see the faces of the men who were brought here to destroy my life tonight. I spotted him almost immediately near the roaring fireplace. Judge Harrison. He was a tall, imposing man with thick silver hair and a stern, authoritative posture. He was nodding solemnly as Bradley whispered something urgent into his ear. The judge briefly looked up, making direct eye contact with me across the crowded room, and his severe expression softened into a mask of profound, misguided pity. He had already made up his mind before the hearing even started. He believed the lie of my dementia. And standing just a few feet away from the judge, nervously sipping red wine near a massive floral arrangement, was Dr. Eris Thorne. The corrupt physician looked terrified. His eyes constantly darted around the room, completely lacking the arrogant confidence of my son. He knew he had committed a massive federal crime by falsifying the death certificate, and the sheer anxiety of his guilt was practically vibrating off his sweating skin. The classical music shifted to a slightly brighter tempo, and that was when I saw her. Monica emerged from the swinging kitchen doors, gliding through the dense crowd, with the effortless grace of a venomous snake slipping through tall grass. She was wearing a perfectly tailored, understated black dress that screamed quiet wealth and false modesty. But it was not the expensive dress that made my stomach turn into a cold, hard knot. It was the jewelry draped around her neck. She was wearing Diane's favorite pearls. They were a rare, perfectly matched string of South Sea pearls I had purchased for our 30th wedding anniversary. Diane had cherished them more than any other possession. She only wore them on the most special occasions, treating them with a delicate, loving reverence. Seeing those beautiful pearls resting against the skin of the woman who had coldly ordered her death was a devastating physical violation. It was a sickening, deliberate display of total dominance. Monica was wearing my dead wife's pearls to her own memorial party, a silent, mocking declaration that she had won the war. It was her way of proving she had consumed Diane's life and was now proudly wearing the spoils of her dark victory. I felt a sudden surge of pure, blinding rage rise in my throat, threatening to completely break my carefully constructed facade. I had to bite the inside of my cheek so hard I instantly tasted the sharp, metallic tang of my own blood, just to keep my expression blank and vacant. Monica quickly spotted me standing near the dining room table. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, and the corners of her mouth curled into a sweet smile. She turned to a passing waiter, smoothly taking a silver tray that held a single crystal flute of vintage champagne. She dismissed the waiter with a flick of her wrist and began walking toward me. I noticed Bradley had repositioned himself near the fireplace, ensuring Judge Harrison had a clear view of me. The trap was finally springing shut. Monica stopped right in front of me, her heavy perfume mingling with the sickeningly sweet scent of the funeral lilies. "You look exhausted, Rick," she said, her voice dripping with artificial honey. "I had the caterers pour you a special glass of your favorite vintage to calm your nerves." She held the polished tray out toward me. I knew exactly what was hidden inside that glass. It was an aggressive, potent hallucinogen designed to trigger a massive psychotic break in front of the judge. I slowly reached out my hand, trembling violently, playing the role of the frail old man one last time. My fingers wrapped around the cold crystal stem. I lifted the glass. Monica did not look away. Across the room, Bradley stopped talking. Dr. Thorne was staring at me. I brought the champagne up toward my face, making direct eye contact with Monica. I opened my mouth, parted my lips, and let the cold edge of the poisoned crystal press gently against my teeth. I tilted the crystal flute backward, letting the cold, effervescent liquid pool at the back of my throat. I did not swallow a drop. My muscles tensed as I held the toxic mixture away from my tongue. I immediately reached into my suit pocket with my free hand, pulling out a thick, dark, monogrammed handkerchief. I pressed the heavy fabric tightly against my mouth and let out a violent, ragged cough. I bent forward, feigning a sudden choking fit, and quietly spat the entire mouthful of laced champagne deep into the absorbent cloth. I coughed twice more for good measure, making sure my face turned slightly red from the exertion. Monica took a step back, a flash of genuine irritation crossing her perfectly composed features before she forced her sympathetic mask back into place. "Oh my goodness, Rick. Are you all right?" she asked loudly, ensuring the guests standing nearby could hear her. She gently patted my shoulder, though her touch felt like the brush of a cold reptile. I nodded weakly, keeping the damp handkerchief pressed against my lips, and mumbled an apology. I told her the bubbles had just gone down the wrong pipe. She smiled, her eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction, and smoothly took the half-empty glass from my trembling hand. She walked away, convinced the chemical payload was coursing through my bloodstream. I gave the hallucinogen time to take effect. I spent the next 20 minutes sitting quietly in a leather armchair near the piano, staring blankly at the roaring fire. I slowed my breathing, letting my posture sag, completely projecting the image of a man whose mind was unraveling. I could feel the eyes of the room drifting toward me. The murmurs and polite laughter continued, but the atmosphere was shifting. Bradley had spent the last hour quietly planting seeds of doubt among the guests, whispering tragic updates about my mental decline. When the time felt right, I began the performance of my life. I pushed myself out of the armchair, intentionally stumbling forward, my knees buckling just enough to cause a mild commotion. A former colleague from the firm rushed over to steady me. I looked at him with unfocused eyes. I called him by the wrong name. I asked him why we were standing in the middle of a train station. The man's face fell, replaced by a look of heartbreaking pity. I slurred my words, dragging my syllables out, allowing my voice to crack and tremble. I pulled away from his supportive grip and began wandering through the crowded living room. Every step I took was carefully calculated to look disconnected from reality. I brushed past the string quartet, accidentally knocking a sheet of music off the cellist's stand, and did not pause to apologize. I muttered nonsensical phrases under my breath, my eyes darting toward the corners of the ceiling as if I were tracking invisible phantoms. The polite conversations around me began to falter, replaced by uncomfortable silence and hushed whispers. People stepped out of my way, their expressions a mixture of deep sorrow and discomfort. I caught sight of Dr. Thorne standing near the hallway. He was watching my every move with clinical detachment, occasionally nodding to himself, mentally preparing to testify that he had witnessed this psychotic episode firsthand. I lumbered toward the dining room, where a large buffet of catered appetizers was displayed on a long mahogany table. I reached out with a shaking hand and picked up an expensive porcelain plate. I stood there for a long moment, staring down at the empty white surface of the plate, my mouth slightly open, my eyes vacant. The room had grown quiet. Dozens of eyes were locked onto the tragic spectacle of the structural engineer losing his mind in the middle of his own home. I let my fingers go limp. The porcelain plate slipped from my grasp and crashed against the hardwood floor. The violent sound of shattering ceramic echoed like a gunshot through the silent house. Shards of white porcelain scattered across the polished wood, sliding over the edges of the Persian rug. Several guests gasped in shock. I did not look down at the broken mess. Instead, I brought my hands up to my head, gripping my gray hair, and let out a low whimper. I backed away from the table, my eyes wide with manufactured terror, scanning the crowd as if I did not recognize a single being in the room. Bradley was at my side in an instant. He pushed through the crowd of frozen guests, his face twisted into a mask of agonizing concern. He grabbed my shoulders, pulling me away from the broken plate, his voice loud and steady. "Dad, it is okay, I am here," he said, projecting his fake empathy to the back of the room. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me tight, playing the role of the devoted son, shielding his broken father from public humiliation. I buried my face in his shoulder, whimpering and trembling, fully committing to the illusion of mental collapse. I let my head loll slightly to the side, peering over Bradley's shoulder, to look across the crowded living room. Standing near the stone fireplace, Judge Harrison was watching the scene unfold, with a grave, sorrowful expression. As I watched, Bradley subtly turned his head. He made eye contact with the judge. My son gave a slow, devastating nod. It was the nod of a man confirming an unspeakable tragedy. Judge Harrison closed his eyes for a brief second and returned the nod, silently acknowledging the heartbreaking truth of Bradley's petition. The trap had sprung. The performance had worked flawlessly. The entire room, including the magistrate who held the power to end my freedom, was completely convinced that my mind was gone. My son believed he had won. He believed I was finished. He had absolutely no idea that the curtain was about to rise on the final act of his life. Bradley gently guided me toward a plush velvet armchair near the grand piano. He lowered me into the seat with exaggerated care, patting my knee as if I were a frightened toddler. I let my head rest against the high back of the chair, my eyes half closed, panting softly, as if the simple act of walking had completely drained my spirit. The room was suffocatingly silent. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the faint rhythmic drumming of the rain against the large bay windows. Bradley stood up slowly, wiping a perfectly timed, non-existent tear from the corner of his eye. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive dark suit, took a deep breath, and walked toward the center of the living room. He signaled to the string quartet, who immediately lowered their instruments. Bradley tapped a silver spoon gently against the side of a crystal glass. The sharp, clear chime rang out, demanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Bradley began, his voice echoing softly through the microphone he pulled from his jacket. He let his words hang in the air, his tone thick with manufactured grief. "We gathered this evening to honor the beautiful memory of my mother, Diane. She was the absolute heart of this family. She was a woman of profound grace, endless kindness, and unmatched generosity. She loved this house. She loved the life she built here with my father. And most of all, she loved him." Bradley gestured toward me, sitting slumped in the armchair. He paused, letting his voice crack with absolute theatrical perfection. "For 40 years, my father was the strongest man I knew. He built the bridges that connect this beautiful city. He was a pillar of strength, a man of brilliant intellect and unyielding logic. He was my hero. Growing up, I believed there was absolutely nothing in this world that could ever break him. But as we have all tragically witnessed tonight, the human mind is incredibly fragile." The guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Bradley and my slumped figure. Monica stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Bradley's shoulder. She looked down at me with an expression of such profound, fake pity that it took every ounce of my willpower not to leap from the chair and wrap my hands around her throat. Bradley placed his hand over hers, continuing his sickening monologue. "Over the past few months following the sudden loss of my mother, we have watched my father slip further and further into the dark, terrifying grip of severe dementia. It started with small things: forgotten names, misplaced keys, confusion about the time of day. But it has rapidly escalated into something truly heartbreaking. He no longer recognizes his own home. He no longer recognizes me. The brilliant engineer who built our city is trapped inside a mind that is collapsing in on itself. Monica and I have brought in specialists. We have tried every medication available." He paused again, making direct, deliberate eye contact with Dr. Thorne, who gave a slow, solemn nod of medical confirmation. Then Bradley looked right at Judge Harrison. But the truth is, I can no longer provide the level of care he desperately needs. He is becoming a danger to himself. Tonight's episode was the final tragic proof that he requires professional, around-the-clock intervention. I cannot stand by and watch the man I love suffer in this terrifying state of confusion. It is the hardest decision a son could ever make, but I have to do what is best for his safety and his dignity. Bradley took a deep, shuddering breath, gripping his microphone tightly. Therefore, after consulting with his doctors, we have made the agonizing choice to transfer him to a specialized, secure psychiatric facility. A medical transport team is waiting outside in the driveway right now. They are here to take him tonight, so he can begin receiving the constant care he requires. A collective murmur of shock and sympathy rippled through the crowded living room. I heard the soft gasps of my former colleagues and the whispered prayers of Diane's charity board members. To them, Bradley was making an impossible, heroic sacrifice. He was the devoted son stepping up to make the heartbreaking medical choice for his ruined father. But sitting there in that velvet chair staring at the polished floorboards, I understood the terrifying reality of his announcement. He was not waiting for the judge to formally grant the conservatorship next week. He was forcing the issue tonight. By having Dr. Thorne sign off on an emergency psychiatric hold, he could legally have me dragged out of my own home strapped to a gurney and locked inside a padded room before the sun even came up. Once I was inside that facility pumped full of heavy mind-erasing sedatives, I would never see the outside world again. The accident they needed would happen quickly behind locked doors. Bradley walked slowly toward me. Monica followed behind him, her eyes fixed on me like a predator closing in on a wounded animal. Two large men in white medical uniforms appeared in the archway of the grand foyer, holding a folded wheelchair. The guests parted for them, stepping back with sad, sympathetic faces. Bradley crouched down in front of my chair, placing his cold hands on my knees. "It is going to be all right, Dad," he whispered gently, his voice carrying just enough volume for the front row of guests to hear. "We are going to get you the help you need. You do not have to be afraid anymore." I looked up at him. I looked past his fake tears, past his expensive suit, and stared directly into the black, empty abyss of his soul. He gave my knee a final reassuring squeeze, believing he had just spoken my absolute final words as a free man. I let his hand rest on my knee for 3 heavy seconds. I wanted him to feel the complete certainty of his false victory. Then I stopped trembling. The violent, pathetic shaking in my hands ceased instantly, as if someone had simply flipped a hidden switch inside my soul. The hunched curvature of my spine, the heavy, defeated slump of my tired shoulders, all of it vanished. I pushed his cold hand off my leg with a slow, deliberate force that made him blink in sudden, disoriented confusion. I planted my feet firmly on the hardwood floor and stood up. I did not struggle to find my balance. I did not rely on the plush armrests of the velvet chair to pull my weight upward. I rose with the fluid, steady strength of a man who had spent a lifetime lifting steel beams and pouring industrial concrete. I drew in a massive breath of air, filling my lungs completely, expanding my chest until I towered over him. Bradley stumbled backward, his carefully constructed mask of sympathetic sorrow faltering for the very first time all evening. He looked up at me, his eyes widening in pure, unfiltered shock, desperately trying to comprehend the physical resurrection happening right in front of him. The frail, broken old man he thought he had successfully conquered was completely gone forever. In his place stood a 73-year-old structural engineer with absolute terrifying clarity in his eyes and a heart forged from cold, unyielding iron. The suffocating silence of the massive living room deepened, transforming rapidly from a quiet, respectful sympathy into a tense, breathless anticipation. Every single wealthy guest in the house seemed to collectively hold their breath, sensing the massive shift in the atmospheric pressure. The two large men in the white medical uniforms froze awkwardly in the archway, their large hands gripping the rubber handles of the folded wheelchair, entirely unsure of their given orders. I turned my head slowly, sweeping my penetrating gaze across the dense crowd of Seattle elites. I did not look confused, lost, or chemically sedated. I looked directly into their stunned faces, acknowledging them with a sharp, highly intelligent focus. I scanned the room and quickly found Dr. Thorne trying to hide near the towering floral arrangements. The color drained from his guilty face so fast, he looked exactly like a walking corpse. I turned my attention and looked directly at Judge Harrison. The powerful magistrate leaned forward, his thick brow furrowing in deep analytical confusion, suddenly realizing that the commanding man standing proudly before him did not match the tragic medical affidavits currently sitting on his desk. Finally, I looked back down at my treacherous son. Bradley opened his mouth to speak, but I did not give him the chance to utter a single syllable. When I finally spoke, my voice did not crack. It did not waver with manufactured weakness. It rang out through the massive room, clear, deep, and completely authoritative, echoing like a crack of thunder across a perfectly silent valley. "I am not going anywhere, Bradley," I said. The heavy words hit him like a brutal physical blow to the chest. He actually took another step back, awkwardly bumping his hip into the edge of the mahogany coffee table. "But you are," I finished. Monica gasped loudly, dropping her angelic mask of sweet sorrow completely. She stepped forward quickly, her hands raised defensively in a desperate, pathetic attempt to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Rick, please, you are just having a severe episode," she said, her voice trembling with a sudden, very real panic. "Please sit back down before you accidentally hurt yourself." I turned my cold gaze to her, my eyes locking instantly onto the beautiful South Sea pearls resting proudly against her neck. I felt a massive surge of absolute sickening disgust, but I kept my external composure perfectly intact. "I am not having an episode, Monica," I replied, my tone dripping with thick, icy contempt. "And I am entirely aware of everything that has happened in this house." The whispering among the wealthy guests erupted into a loud, anxious hum of chaotic energy. People were looking at each other, murmuring urgent questions, desperately trying to make sense of the drastic, unprecedented shift in reality. Bradley looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting frantically toward the medical transport team, subtly gesturing for them to move in and grab me by force. But I was miles ahead of his pathetic, desperate tactical maneuvers. I raised my left hand proudly, pulling back the tailored sleeve of my dark suit to reveal the heavy black smartwatch strapped securely to my wrist. I had spent the last 3 days programming this exact flawless sequence with Elias seamlessly integrating the house's advanced smart system, directly with the encrypted offshore servers containing his absolute ruin. I looked directly at Judge Harrison one last time, ensuring the powerful magistrate was paying absolute undivided attention to the stage, and then I pressed a single tactile button on the side of the watch face. Instantly, the house responded to my silent command. The massive floor-to-ceiling smart glass windows lining the entire back wall of the sprawling living room suddenly tinted to a solid, impenetrable black. The heavy rain and the dark Seattle night were completely shut out, locking everyone inside my private theater. The ambient lighting in the room automatically dimmed down to a cinematic, moody low. A heavy mechanical whirring sound echoed ominously from above, drawing every eye upward. Everyone watched in stunned silence as a massive 100-inch high-definition projector screen descended smoothly from a hidden, recessed compartment in the vaulted ceiling. It locked into place right in front of the stone fireplace dominating the room. The brilliant digital trap I had so carefully constructed over the past 2 weeks was now fully armed, loaded, and inescapably deployed. There was absolutely no way out for the monsters standing frozen in front of me. The massive projector screen glowed a brilliant, harsh white for a fraction of a second before the digital file initiated. I had deliberately bypassed the standard audio limiters on the home theater system, routing the sound directly through the high-fidelity floor speakers and the heavy subwoofers hidden within the walls. When the video began, it did not ease into the room. It exploded. The horrific rattling sound of my wife gasping for her final breaths blasted through the living room at maximum volume. It was a wet, desperate mechanical sound of failing lungs magnified to a deafening roar that physically shook the crystal glasses on the catering tables. Several guests instinctively covered their ears, flinching away from the sudden auditory assault. The string quartet cellist dropped his bow, the wood clattering against the polished floor. On the screen, the shaky first-person perspective from Diane's smart glasses filled the room. The camera angle was low, displaying the intricate woven pattern of the Persian rug that lay just a few feet away from where we were currently standing. The confusion on the faces of the Seattle elites lasted only for a few agonizing seconds. As the terrifying realization of what they were actually watching began to set in, the polite murmurs of high society morphed into sharp gasps of pure, unadulterated horror. They were watching a woman die. They were watching the beloved philanthropist they had come to mourn fighting a losing battle for her life on the floor of her own home. I kept my eyes locked on Bradley. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume. The blood drained from his face so rapidly that his skin took on the waxy, translucent pallor of a cadaver. He was completely paralyzed, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream of absolute terror. He recognized the camera angle. He recognized the rug. He knew exactly what was about to happen next, and he was entirely powerless to stop it. On the massive screen, the camera tilted upward violently, shaking as Diane writhed in agony. And then the two pairs of shoes stepped into the frame. The expensive Italian leather loafers, the sharp designer heels. The crowd in my living room collectively stopped breathing. The silence among the guests was so profound that you could have heard a pin drop completely overpowered by the deafening audio playing from the speakers. Then came the voices. The high-definition audio picked up Monica's cold, callous tone with terrifying clarity. "Let her go," her voice echoed through the grand room, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings and the horrified faces of the guests. "Calling 911 ruins the timeline." A woman standing near the front row, a close friend of Diane from the charity board, let out a piercing shriek and covered her mouth with trembling hands. A wealthy venture capitalist, who had just been patting Bradley on the back a few moments earlier, physically backed away, staring at my son as if he had just sprouted horns. The video showed Bradley looking at his watch, completely ignoring his mother's agonizing death rattle. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of their profound evil broadcast in 4,000 pixel resolution for the entire city's elite to witness. There was no context that could explain it away. There was no high-priced lawyer who could twist that footage into a misunderstanding. It was cold, calculated, premeditated murder, and every single person in the room had just become a witness. The sheer panic that erupted from the villains was instantaneous and utterly chaotic. Monica was the first to completely break. The elegant, composed hostess who had been wearing my dead wife's pearls just moments ago let out a guttural, animalistic scream. She dropped the silver tray she was holding, sending the poisoned crystal flute of champagne shattering against the hardwood floor. The liquid splashed across her expensive black dress, but she did not care. She spun around, her eyes wild with the primal terror of a trapped rat, and bolted toward the grand foyer. She shoved a caterer out of the way, her designer heels slipping on the polished wood, desperately lunging for the heavy oak front doors. But she forgot the watch on my wrist. I had triggered a total lockdown. She grabbed the brass handles and yanked with all her might, but the electronic deadbolts were firmly engaged. She began pounding her fists against the thick wood, screaming for someone to let her out, completely abandoning the illusion of her innocence. While Monica threw herself against the reinforced doors, Dr. Thorne made his own desperate bid for freedom. The corrupt physician, realizing that his entire life was about to be destroyed by a federal investigation, tried to slip away unnoticed. He abandoned his glass of wine and quickly moved toward the back hallway, intending to escape through the kitchen service entrance. I watched him scurry like a cockroach fleeing the light. He pushed through the swinging doors, but I had already sealed that exit as well. A moment later, I saw him reappear in the archway, his face shining with a cold sweat, his chest heaving with panic. He looked around the room, making eye contact with the furious, disgusted faces of the wealthy guests, who now fully understood his role in this nightmare. He backed against the wall, sliding down until he was practically crouching on the floor, trapped in the very house where he had signed a fraudulent death certificate for $250,000. Bradley did not run. He could not. The absolute shock of his public exposure had instantly severed the connection between his panicked brain and his useless legs. He stood completely frozen in the center of the room, surrounded by the powerful people he had so desperately tried to manipulate. The horrific video on the massive screen abruptly cut to black, plunging the room into a heavy silence. The show was over. The truth won. But the black screen did not remain dark for long. I had no intention of letting my son hide behind the shock of the murder footage. The projector flared back to life, illuminating the horrified faces of the wealthy guests with a stark, cold light. I pressed another button on my smartwatch, advancing my digital dossier to the next devastating chapter. A series of highly encrypted emails appeared on the massive screen. They were magnified so large that every person in the room could clearly read the frantic, desperate words my son had typed. I did not need a microphone to explain what they were looking at. My voice carried easily through the paralyzed crowd. I told them about the total collapse of his venture capital firm. I explained the massive Ponzi scheme he had been running right under their noses. I watched the faces of his wealthy investors contort with a new kind of terror, the realization that their fortunes were tied directly to a desperate criminal. The projected emails detailed the $8 million debt he owed to a brutal Chicago crime syndicate. They saw the violent threats. They saw his pathetic begging. They saw the exact calculated timeline that forced him to sacrifice his own mother to buy himself 30 days of miserable survival. The murmurs of the crowd grew into a rising tide of furious outrage, but I was still not finished. I swiped my finger across the tablet interface, and the emails were instantly replaced by his offshore bank ledgers. Row after row of illicit wire transfers filled the entire screen. I highlighted the massive $6 million transaction. The money stolen directly from Diane's private trust routed instantly to the mafia's holding account just 2 days after we buried her. And right below that massive sum, I displayed the $250,000 payout. I read the routing number aloud, tracing it directly to the private consulting firm owned by Dr. Eris Thorne. Every eye in the living room immediately snapped toward the dark hallway, where the corrupt physician was cowering against the wall. He raised his hands in a weak, trembling gesture of surrender, completely unable to utter a single word in his own defense. The undeniable paper trail was projected brilliantly behind me, a glowing monument to their collective greed and staggering depravity. The false narrative of my dementia was completely obliterated, replaced by a meticulously documented criminal conspiracy. From the back of the room near the grand piano, a familiar figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Jonathan Wright, my longtime attorney and truest friend. He had been standing there the entire time, quietly observing the masterpiece of destruction we had prepared together. He held his heavy leather briefcase in one hand and his cell phone in the other. He looked at Judge Harrison, giving the powerful magistrate a solemn, respectful nod. The judge slowly shook his head in absolute disbelief, his eyes fixed on the damning financial documents on the screen, finally understanding how close he had come to becoming an unwitting pawn in a murder plot. Suddenly, a faint, high-pitched wail pierced through the heavy drumming of the rain outside. It grew louder by the second, multiplying into a chaotic chorus of blaring sirens. The sound cut through the tense atmosphere of the living room, echoing off the high ceilings. Bradley snapped out of his catatonic trance. A brief, desperate flicker of hope flashed across his pale, sweating face. He looked at the tinted windows, then turned to me, his chest heaving with frantic breaths. The medical transport, he stammered, his voice cracking with a pathetic, infantile desperation. "They are here for you. They are taking you away." I looked at him with a gaze so cold, It could have frozen the blood in his veins. I slowly shook my head. "Those are not ambulances, Bradley," I said quietly, though my voice carried immense weight. "The medical transport was never coming. I canceled your fraudulent request 3 days ago." The red and blue emergency lights began to flash violently outside, illuminating the dark driveway and casting rapid, strobing shadows through the edges of the window frames. The sirens abruptly cut off, replaced by the heavy slamming of car doors and the sharp, authoritative shouting of armed men. I pressed the final button on my smartwatch. The heavy electronic deadbolts on the front doors disengaged with a loud mechanical click. The massive oak doors burst open, letting in a gust of freezing wind and heavy rain. A dozen heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, flanked by local Seattle police officers, stormed into the grand foyer. They moved with absolute tactical precision, their dark windbreakers wet from the storm. The elite guests parted like the Red Sea, scrambling out of the way as the federal agents flooded into the living room. Jonathan Wright immediately stepped forward, handing a thick manila folder of printed evidence directly to the lead agent. The commander barked orders, and 2 officers sprinted toward the hallway to physically restrain Dr. Thorne against the wall. Monica, still sobbing hysterically by the front entrance, was quickly surrounded. But the lead FBI agent walked straight toward the center of the room, his eyes locked on my son. The empire Bradley built on the bones of his family was completely crashing down around him. His legs finally gave out. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor, falling hard onto his knees right in front of me. The tears streaming down his cheeks were genuine. He reached out, grabbing my suit trousers with trembling hands. He begged, "Dad, please, they'll kill me in prison." I looked down at him. I did not bend down to comfort him. I gently pulled my leg back, giving my response. "You stopped being my son the moment you let her die," I replied. The lead agent hauled him up. The cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly shut. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the walls of my living room in a chaotic, rhythmic pulse. I watched in absolute silence as the federal agents escorted my son out the front door. He did not look back. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped, the arrogant posture of the wealthy hedge fund manager completely erased by the harsh reality of his impending doom. Monica was dragged out moments later, screaming obscenities, her designer dress ruined and her reputation permanently destroyed. The guests left shortly after filing out into the cold Seattle rain in a state of profound shock. When the heavy oak doors finally closed for the last time that night, the sprawling mansion was plunged into a deep, echoing quiet. I stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the remnants of a shattered party, and for the first time in 6 months, I felt the crushing weight of grief begin to lift from my chest. 6 months have passed since that night. The legal proceedings were swift and absolutely merciless. The mountain of digital evidence Elias and I had gathered proved entirely insurmountable for their high-priced defense attorneys. Bradley did not even try to take his criminal case to trial. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. He is currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole in a maximum security federal penitentiary. But the thick concrete walls of his small cell do not offer him any true protection. The Chicago syndicate he owes $8 million to has a very long reach extending far beyond the barbed wire fences of the prison system. Jonathan told me that Bradley spends every single day looking over his shoulder, terrified of his own shadow, knowing that the massive debt he accumulated will eventually be collected in blood. He traded his own mother's beautiful life for a temporary financial reprieve, and now he will spend the rest of his miserable existence waiting for the violent reaper to arrive in the dark. Monica did not fare any better in the aftermath of their exposure. The federal authorities froze all of her assets, immediately seizing her offshore bank accounts, her expensive sports cars, and the luxury home I had so foolishly helped them purchase. She was officially stripped of every single piece of wealth she had conspired to steal from my family. She is currently awaiting sentencing, facing 20 long years in a federal prison for criminal conspiracy and accessory to murder. As for Dr. Aris Thorne, his medical license was permanently revoked the very next morning. He is serving a 10-year sentence for medical fraud and evidence tampering, his once lucrative career reduced to absolute ashes. The twisted empire they tried to build on the foundation of my planned destruction was completely dismantled, piece by piece, until absolutely nothing remained but the cold, hard truth of their overwhelming greed. With the monsters finally locked away behind steel bars, I could no longer stay in that beautiful house. The walls held far too many memories, both beautiful and deeply horrifying. I sold the massive estate a few months ago to a young, vibrant family who will hopefully fill those spacious rooms with genuine love and laughter. I took the entire $12 million estate, every single penny that Bradley had so desperately tried to steal, and I created something truly enduring. I established the Diane Campbell Foundation in honor of my late wife. We currently operate out of a modest office building in downtown Seattle, employing a highly dedicated team of aggressive legal advocates, forensic financial auditors, and compassionate social workers. Our sole mission is to provide free, immediate protection for elderly individuals who are being financially exploited, medically neglected, or emotionally abused by their own families. We actively investigate suspicious conservatorship petitions. We audit stolen retirement funds. We fight back against the ruthless monsters who believe that aging makes a person an easy target. I used the vast fortune my son tried to kill me for to ensure that no other senior citizen in this city will ever have to face that kind of terrifying darkness alone. My long life as a dedicated structural engineer taught me that a bridge is only as strong as the materials used to safely build it. You simply cannot construct a lasting monument using rotten wood and rusted iron. I spent 40 long years trying to build a safe bridge for my only son, pouring my love, wealth, and energy into his foundation. But I foolishly ignored the early warning signs. I ignored the structural flaws in his character, believing my financial support could somehow compensate for his complete lack of a moral compass. I learned the absolute hardest lesson a father can learn. You cannot save a structure designed to collapse, and you cannot buy loyalty from a heart that only values currency. True strength does not come from the blood running through your veins. It comes from the difficult choices you make when the pressure is highest. I lost my wife to an act of evil, and I lost my son to his own insatiable greed. But in the aftermath of that storm, I found a new purpose. I built a new foundation, one that is truly indestructible, forged from the necessity of justice and the enduring memory of the woman I loved. My name is Rick Campbell. I am 73 years old, and I am finally living a life built on absolute truth. I no longer hide in the dark shadows of my own home, and I no longer pretend to be a weak, broken man. I stood up to the very people who deeply underestimated my worth, and I took back my complete dignity. Thank you for listening. Did you like my story? Which city are you watching from? Subscribe and remember. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family.